There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a ranch just before a storm breaks, a heavy, static-charged quiet that makes the hair on your arms stand up. And that was exactly how the air felt the morning the sheriff rolled up my gravel driveway to hand me an eviction notice for my own damn land. I'm standing there, boots sinking into soil that my grandfather, Silas Vance, fought to tame back in 1923, holding a cup of coffee that suddenly tasted like ash, staring at a piece of paper telling me I had 30 days to vacate 200 acres of history because some homeowners association president decided my legacy belonged to her subdivision. The smell of diesel from my idling cattle truck was mixing with the scent of wet pine, and all I could think about was Eleanor. We buried her ashes under the massive cottonwood tree by the creek 18 months ago, right where we planned to build a gazebo for the grandkids that never came. And now, a stranger named Victoria Sterling was claiming that very tree, along with every fence post and blade of grass, was actually illegal encroachments on her master plan community's land. You have to understand, I'm Arthur Vance, 58 years old, a retired petroleum engineer who spent 3 decades managing high-pressure pipelines across the Dakotas. And if there is one thing the oil fields teach you, it's that when pressure builds silently underground, it eventually blows the whole rig sky high if you aren't paying attention. I thought ranching in the Colorado foothills would be the quiet epilogue to a loud life. A place to heal after cancer took Eleanor and left me with nothing but medical bills and a silence too big for one man to fill. That morning, Victoria Sterling stepped out of her pristine white Range Rover like she was descending from a spaceship, her heels clicking on my weathered porch with a sound that grated on my soul, looking at my beat-up Ford F-150 with the kind of pity you give a dying animal. She was the president of the Cypress Ridge Community Association, a development that sprang up 2 miles east of here about a decade ago, bringing with it perfectly manicured lawns and people who complain about the smell of livestock. "Mr. Vance," she said, extending a hand that had never seen a day of labor, waving a sheaf of documents that looked official enough to ruin a life. "According to the Cypress Ridge Master Development Deed from 1965, your property is an illegal subdivision of our common area, and per the reversionary clause, ownership automatically reverts to the association. Reversionary clauses are real, nasty pieces of legal machinery that can strip a man of his property without a dime of compensation if certain conditions are met." But I laughed in her face because my family was branding cattle on this dirt while her community was still just a twinkle in a developer's eye. "Lady," I told her, fighting the urge to tear the papers from her hand, "my grandfather homesteaded this place 40 years before your subdivision was even a blueprint. So the only thing reverting here is you, back to your side of the fence." That was the moment her smile died, replaced by a look of cold, reptilian calculation, and she pulled out her phone to dial 911, reporting a hostile squatter on community property, which is how I ended up watching my friend, Deputy Miller, look at me with apologetic eyes as he served me the court summons. Standing there, touching the rough bark of Eleanor's tree, I realized this wasn't just a mistake. It was an act of war initiated by a woman who looked at my family's history and saw nothing but a line item on a balance sheet. I needed a lawyer, but Eleanor's treatments had drained the accounts dry, so I called Elias Thorne, a man whose office smelled like old law books and stale tobacco, and who agreed to take the case only because my neighbor, Old Man Reynolds, co-signed a loan against his tractor to cover the retainer. Elias spread Victoria's paperwork across his desk, his brow furrowing deeper with every page turn, muttering that this was either the most sophisticated fraud he'd ever seen or I was about to lose everything I loved. We spent 6 hours drowning in legalese, and that's when the engineer in me kicked in, the part of my brain wired to find the stress fractures in a pipeline before it bursts. Victoria's documents referenced a specific deed number from the 1960s, a filing code that supposedly proved the entire valley was originally owned by Cypress Ridge, so Elias and I drove down to the county courthouse basement, a place where records go to die under layers of dust and bureaucracy. Clerk Henderson, a woman who has been guarding those archives since the Reagan administration and knows where every skeleton is buried, took one look at the deed number Victoria cited, deed 1965 to 847, and shook her head with a confused frown. "Honey," she said, her voice raspy from years of inhaling archive dust, "that number doesn't exist. Our system skipped from 846 to 848 that year because of a flood that destroyed a week's worth of filings. Nobody was assigned 847. It was a crack in the dam, a tiny fissure in Victoria's perfect narrative, because legitimate legal documents don't reference ghost numbers. And when we pulled the original plat maps from the yellowed, cracking pages of the 1960 registry, it was clear as day that Cypress Ridge was drawn around my ranch, not over it. I went home that night and dug out Eleanor's old gardening journals, where she had obsessively documented every boundary line and fence post we repaired together, her handwriting a painful reminder of what I was fighting for, and I whispered to the empty room. She picked the wrong engineer. She doesn't know what happens when you try to cap a high-pressure well with cheap concrete. But Victoria wasn't backing down. In fact, when Elias filed a motion to dismiss based on the fraudulent deed number, she escalated the conflict with a terrifying level of aggression, filing an emergency injunction claiming my mental instability due to grief made me a danger to the community. She got a judge to grant a temporary restraining order that barred me from the eastern 100 acres of my own ranch, the acres where my water well and equipment barn sat, leaving my 50 head of cattle without access to water in the heat of a scorching Colorado summer. Watching my animals press against the fence, bellowing for water I couldn't give them because a piece of paper said I'd go to jail if I crossed a line on my own property, something inside me snapped, shifting from defensive to predatory. I hired Dr. Evelyn Chase, a forensic document examiner from Denver who cost money I definitely didn't have, but I needed to know how Victoria was manufacturing these seamless lies. Dr. Chase put Victoria's historic survey maps under spectral imaging lights, and what she found was the smoking gun that turns a civil dispute into a criminal conspiracy. "Mr. Vance," she said, pointing to a tiny string of numbers in the corner of the map that looked like ink splatter to the naked eye. "These are GPS metadata tags embedded in the digital file before it was printed, and this specific satellite positioning format wasn't invented until 1995, yet this document claims to be from 1965. The realization that Victoria Sterling was forging documents on her home computer using technology that didn't exist when the papers were supposedly filed hit me like a physical blow, a mix of vindication and terrifying clarity. She wasn't just mistaken. She was a predator, cutting and pasting signatures, altering dates, and constructing a false reality to steal land, and I realized then that she was too good at this for me to be her first victim. I started reaching out to the neighboring ranchers, men like Tom and Bill, hard-faced guys who usually kept to themselves, and we gathered at Bill's kitchen table only to discover they were all facing the exact same nightmare. Lawsuits from Cypress Ridge, claims of illegal subdivision, and offers from Victoria to buy them out for pennies on the dollar to save them from legal ruin. It was a pattern, a systematic land grab, and when I set up trail cameras along my fence line, I caught footage of Victoria's landscaping crew sneaking onto my property at 3 a.m., moving survey stakes and burying fake markers to match her forged maps. But here is where the story takes a turn into the dark, because Victoria must have sensed the walls closing in, or maybe she just got greedy, because she filed a motion claiming my grandfather, Silas, had originally stolen the land from the government, attacking my family's honor to freeze my assets. The bank froze my accounts, the tractor loan was called in, and the local news ran a segment painting me as the unstable rancher squatting on community land, destroying my reputation in a town where a man's word is his currency. I spent 3 nights in the attic, digging through a trunk that hadn't been opened since my grandmother passed, breathing in the scent of cedar and mothballs until my fingers brushed against a canvas-wrapped bundle at the very bottom. Inside were the original 1923 homestead approvals, signed by the governor himself, and a series of black and white photographs showing our barn standing tall on this land 40 years before Victoria's developer was even born. We took this to Clerk Henderson, who helped us trace the corporate history of the original Cypress Ridge Development Corp. That Victoria claimed to inherit rights from, and we discovered the corporation had been dissolved by the state in 1968 for fraud. It never owned land. It never had assets. It was a ghost entity she had resurrected to terrify old people into giving up their deeds. But when Elias filed this evidence, Victoria didn't fold. She went nuclear, filing criminal stalking charges against me, claiming I had threatened her children at their private school, producing video footage of my truck in the school parking lot. I was looking at felony charges, my freedom hanging by a thread, until my old engineering buddy Marcus connected me with his niece, Agent Harper Cole of the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We met at a truck stop diner, the kind of place where you can smell the grease in the parking lot, and Agent Cole listened to my story with the intensity of a hawk spotting a field mouse, her eyes narrowing as I laid out the forged deeds, the GPS metadata, and the pattern of attacks on rural landowners. "Mr. Vance," she said, sliding the folder across the table, "if she is fabricating federal evidence and using wire transfers to collect fees based on fraudulent land claims, this isn't a property dispute anymore. It's RICO, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, and we are going to burn her down." The twist, the moment that made my blood run cold and hot at the same time, was when Agent Cole revealed that the FBI had already been looking at Victoria not for the land, but for the money. It turned out the Cypress Ridge HOA was a shell. For 12 years, 340 families had been paying $850 a month for amenities that didn't exist, a pool that was never built, security patrols that were never hired, legal fees that went straight into Victoria's offshore accounts. She was stealing nearly $3.5 million a year, and she needed legal authority over the surrounding rural land, my ranch, Bill's farm, to legitimize the fake community expansion projects she was using to launder the money. Agent Cole told me to hold the line, to let Victoria think she was winning, to let her tighten the noose around her own neck while they built the federal case. But then Victoria tried to bribe Clerk Henderson with $25,000 to backdate records, and Henderson, bless her heart, was wearing a wire provided by the feds. Then she tried to bribe my lawyer, Elias, offering him 50 grand to throw my case, which he recorded with a shaking hand and a grin that said gotcha. The pressure was immense. I was watching Victoria strut around town, telling anyone who would listen that I was a dangerous lunatic, while I knew federal agents were listening to her phone calls where she instructed her committee members to lie under oath. The annual HOA meeting was coming up in 10 days, the night Victoria had to present her financials to the residents, and Agent Cole told me, "That's the kill zone, Arthur. We need her to lie to those 340 families while we are recording. We need her to commit wire fraud and perjury in public, and you are going to be the one to ask the questions that hang her." The night of the Cypress Ridge annual meeting, the community center was packed so tight you couldn't slide a piece of paper between the bodies, a room filled with 340 families who had no idea they were sheep being sheared by the woman standing at the podium. Victoria Sterling wore a suit that probably cost more than my tractor, radiating the kind of arrogance that only comes when you truly believe you are untouchable, smiling down at her neighbors like a benevolent queen while federal agents disguised as civilians quietly locked the exits. I sat in the back, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, clutching the remote control Agent Cole had slipped me, waiting for the moment to spring the trap. Victoria started her speech, talking about necessary fee increases and security concerns caused by unstable locals, casting a glare directly at me. And that was my cue to stand up, my boots heavy on the polished floor, my voice trembling with adrenaline, but loud enough to cut through the hum of the crowd. "Point of order, Victoria," I called out, and the room went deathly silent. She sneered, dismissing me as a non-member with no voting rights, claiming my land was already hers, but I kept walking toward the stage. "I just have one question for the gathered families. Can anyone tell me the address of the community pool you've been paying for since 2012? Confusion rippled through the room like a wave, neighbors looking at neighbors, realizing simultaneously that they had never actually seen the pool, the security guards, or the landscaping crews. Victoria tried to shout me down, claiming it was in planning phases, but I clicked the remote, and the projection screen behind her lit up not with her fake charts, but with her personal bank records, page after page of transfers showing millions of dollars in HOA fees flowing directly into her private accounts in the Cayman Islands. The room erupted into chaos, a wall of sound as years of trust shattered in an instant. But the real dagger came when Martha Higgins, the terrified community treasurer, stood up with tears streaming down her face and admitted, "She made me fake the reports. There is no money. It's all gone." Victoria screamed that I was framing her, that the documents were forged, But she never finished that sentence because the side doors burst open and Agent Cole walked in, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, followed by a tactical team that made the room freeze. Victoria Sterling. Agent Cole's voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the pandemonium. You are under arrest for wire fraud, racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was the sweetest sound I have ever heard, louder than the applause that broke out a few seconds later, a thunderous release of tension from hundreds of people who realized the vampire had finally been pulled off their necks. As they marched her out past me, her face a mask of ruined mascara and shock, I leaned in and whispered, "My land predates you, and it will outlast you." The aftermath was a whirlwind, seizure of assets, the sale of her luxury cars and homes to pay back the victims, and a plea deal that put her behind bars for 28 years. But the ending, the real ending, wasn't the arrest, it was what happened next. The community, leaderless and broken, voted right there on the spot to install an emergency board, and in a twist of irony that would make a writer blush, they nominated me, the outsider, as the new president of the HOA. They figured if I could take down the fraud, I could rebuild the trust. I accepted, not for power, but to dismantle the system that hurt us. We dissolved the bogus contracts, established transparency, and I used a portion of my legal settlement to start the Eleanor Vance Integrity Fund, helping other rural families fight abusive land grabs. Sitting under the cottonwood tree today, watching the sun dip below the Colorado peaks, the ranch is quiet again, but it's a good quiet now, a peaceful silence. I saved the land, I honored my wife, and I learned that sometimes you have to walk through the fire to protect what's yours. But it leaves you wondering, if a system designed to protect neighborhoods can be weaponized so easily against them, how many other Victoria Sterlings are out there right now, collecting fees and drawing lines on maps, just waiting for someone to stand up and say no? Drop a comment if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the edge of the law. I'm Arthur Vance, and this is my land.